All right. Welcome back to Conversations from the Underground. This is the year 2023. And you guys should already know by now how we operate and how we get down. So we'll just start off as we normally do, breaking bread, touching base, and then we'll just see where the conversation goes from there. So what's up, Brad?
Oh man, how you doing, man? It's been good. You know, uh, Started the new year, trying to get everything ready.
Yeah,
Classes start next week.
yeah.
Been
Um,
tumultuous, I would say, in our break since when the last time we had one of these? December, late December.
at least a month, I want to say,
Yeah,
because if we did it every week leading up to the end of the semester. We ended fall like December 14th.
yeah. And so we're trying to
So,
take breaks between fall and spring.
right.
Not sure about summer yet, but at least right now our goal is just once a week every week during the fall and spring semester. So
Right.
getting started pretty good with Martin Luther King uh, weekend, I guess.
Yeah, and just for clarity, we need to remind everybody that we'll be dropping new episodes Monday. Like Monday, they are hitting with maybe the
Martin
sole
Luther,
exception um, today. Oh, I'm sorry, not today, but like for Martin Luther King, in observance of Martin Luther King, in reverence of Dr. King. Um, we might have to push it to Tuesday.
yeah, for sure,
So
for sure.
it only makes sense.
Yeah, we've done a lot of Martin Luther King events for TCC during our. I think you said last week is like 13 years together now,
Yeah,
right?
at least, yeah.
Yeah, there's been a few different projects that we've done over the years. That's interesting. How you had sent me something, I think, through text about Martin Luther King Day and Robert E. Lee Day.
Right.
Was that you saying that?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. It was a bank. A
I mean,
bank posted.
when did this start happening? I mean,
So
think about that. I don't remember much of people saying things like Robert E. Lee Day. I've heard people complain about the need for Martin Luther King Day. I've heard people complain about the purpose. Um, but juxtaposing it with a Robert E. Lee Day was
it
interesting.
definitely, well, so um, you know, uh, with social media, with access to information, uh, being, more abundant than ever before, we become more aware of these type of, I don't know, hidden gems of sorts. But I'll say this, you know, when Black Lives Matter started, then you're going to hear people talking about, well, all lives matter started. So if you're going to do this, then we're going to do that. You're going to celebrate this, we're going to celebrate that. Now we can flip it. Let's talk about Columbus Day. Columbus Day has been recognized in for quite some time, definitely throughout um, throughout our academic career. Even when you
Mhm.
went to school, I'm almost positive they had Columbus Day. When I was in elementary school, we had Columbus Day. The issue, I think, it's not even an issue. The reality is that Columbus Day has always been celebrated. Now, there has been a push to celebrate, as opposed to Columbus Day, how about Indigenous Peoples Day, right? And so, is that official? No, it's not official, but it's definitely it's a response to something a community does not care for. So obviously, there's a community who do not care for um, Columbus, Christopher Columbus, and in response to that, they want to target um, Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think that the recent wave of the Robert E. Lee day, if you will, is because of the fact that Martin Luther King Day exists, and he is the only American that has a national holiday named after him. He's the only American. Like, so if you look at every federal holiday, I believe Dr. King is the only one to have one.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe I see the connection, I guess. Martin Luther King Day, a name. Robert E. Lee, a name. I don't know much of any other, like, maybe somebody didn't really think about that well enough, because I see the continuity and connection between Columbus and indigenous. Columbus came and is responsible for, quite a bit of destruction and eradication campaigns towards indigenous cultures. And you think about the disease, the warfare, the subjugation of indigenous people. And so we know why Columbus Day exists, right? As a national sort of attempt to equate nationalism with territory. And even though there was no U.S. history for hundreds of years prior to this guy dying, this attempt to try to connect land with nation states oftentimes leads people to teleologically use history for their own benefits or for their own purposes, or anachronistically look at something for the present day. So Indigenous Peoples Day is an attempt to come back and reverse that. Like, here, right, you're celebrating this mass murderer, they would say. We want to flip it and call it Indigenous Day to kind of explain what happened to Native Americans throughout the course of history once Columbus landed in what he called Hispaniola, right? But with Lee and King, I mean, two entirely different eras. One's a philosopher, the other's a military general who was a U.S. American military general who was very conflicted as to whether or not he was going to join the Confederacy in the first place, right? Because he was kind of stuck there in that West Virginia kind of struggle. And he, in fact, didn't like the idea of needing to leave and break up the United States, but he ultimately went with the people he was around. And so maybe if you're going to pick like some, I don't know, Buckley or some conservative intellectual to juxtapose to King.
Well, I mean, and this just speaks to the lack of understanding history. It's not, right. What you're doing is you're providing the substance, and that's too much because all the people really want is the symbol. So anybody who might, when Robert E. Lee is the symbol of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee is a symbol of the South. Robert E. Lee is the symbol of antebellum America, and because of that, they use Robert E. Lee. And again, coincidentally, his birthday is, I think, the same day as. It's a birthday issue. Yeah, it's a birthday. Now, here's the other thing. There are currently 2 states that recognize Robert E. Lee Day on Dr. King's Day. There's only 2 states that do it. And you can take a guess where they are regionally in the United States. All right, I think it's Alabama. I think it's Mississippi and Alabama.
Yeah, I'm about to say.
Now Texas recognized Robert E. Lee Day as early as 1931. Okay. So the notion of recognizing Robert E. Lee was not necessarily in response to Dr. King. That's not true, because there had already been days dedicated to Robert E. Lee before Dr. King. Let me see. He died in 68, 40. So 28. Dr. King was only 3 years old when Texas um, had observed Robert E. Lee Day. So, but that's not my point either. What I'm getting at is I think there's a resurgence of sorts to maybe recognizing Robert E. Lee Day, and not by many. And obviously, it's a jab. It's a jab at this is what I remember growing up, and I don't like it, so I'm going to counter it with this. You guys have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm going to change Dr. King's Day to Robert E. Lee Day. It's that type of stuff.
I'm interested. I mean, I don't know much about this. I'm not very much into military history, so I rarely waste my time on it from my perspective. Apologize to all you military historians out there. But why is it that Robert E. Lee is the symbol of the Confederacy? I mean, maybe it's just my lack of perhaps respect for these political figures or military generals or wars and political maneuvering of people from the top. When I think of symbols, it's to me it's something much different. But why is that the case? I wonder. Is it because he won a lot of time?
So, well, first off, he's when you look at major generals of the Confederacy, he's one of the few from beginning to end to control such a large portion of the Confederate Army.
But didn't he screw up? I remember, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember the actual details, but he dropped some sort of letter and another general found it and messed up their whole plan and I mean, like, this guy's like dropping stuff on a battlefield, screwing up the South. That's who you want to pick as your symbol? Like, what's so great about Robert E. Lee?
He won some battles. He won a lot of battles.
Some battles, but he lost the most important ones, didn't he? Because he gave up. I figure, didn't he? He didn't die in battle, did he?
No.
Martyrs usually, oftentimes, you can say for Martin Luther King, but
and that's fair. He wouldn't sacrifice it. Maybe the argument is that he didn't want to sacrifice any more of his men or any more of the Southern men. There's a legend and lore associated with Robert E. Lee that's akin to, George Washington. You look at a lot of politicians, most of them have military backgrounds. Someone joining the military kind of gives off the impression that there's an element of an everyday Joe of sorts. The very first, outside of George Washington, only Andrew Jackson. Think about the legend and lore that comes with Andrew Jackson serving as a general, becoming incredibly popular after the War of 1812, using that as a stepping stone to his own political ambitions or career, what have you. And this is not just an American thing; it's international. Look at Caesar, look at anybody that has. There's something about the military that your average human tends to, admire or respect. We do it here with the support the troops stuff.
Yeah.
So this recognition of Robert E. Lee Day was well before Dr. King. I just think that we're seeing like maybe a resurgence of it only as a way to redirect the narrative.
Yeah.
Because Dr. King
bothering them, right? What's the problem with the narrative that we have for those who observe Robert E. Lee Day? When we get down to it, what's the problem that they have with Martin Luther King Day? Is it integration itself?
I would say so. And here's, I think the other argument might be, and then look, all this is like conjecture, it's like what I'm thinking. But what I imagine, so all I do is what is it about Columbus that bothers Native Americans? And then what is it about Dr. King that bothers these individuals that would rather celebrate Robert E. Lee Day. And it has to be, at least for Dr. King, it has to be the fact that maybe they feel threatened. They feel threatened by the reworking of American history, because when you elevate an individual like Dr. King, you're forced to expose America for what it's worth. The most venerated American of all time. Streets named after him in almost every city, major city in the United States. A massive statue in Washington, D.C. That other statue that was just constructed for $10 million. That was kind of weird, but whatever. Have you seen it?
Yeah, it does look weird. It's just like some hands like grappling.
Well, it's Dr. King hugging Coretta Scott.
Yeah.
And so the artist only wanted to capture the hugging part.
Well, I would say why is King such a popular figure has a lot to do with a cultural paradigm shift that we saw occur in this country after World War II. In the sort of big battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, where many anti-integrationists could mask their anti-integrationism under the guise of communism, under the guise of the fear of the communists, the Hoovers and whatnot. But then I think like sort of in the 60s and the 70s, when it became more accepted, more popular, more cultural capital to be acquired by supporting integration, King became the symbol of this new movement because he gave his life for it. He dedicated his life to it before he lost his life to it. He was brilliantly articulate, and organized, I think, very masterfully. All of these things, I think, combined to make him this quintessential figure. Not to mention the fact that what he was saying was, more comfortable, I think, for white liberals at the time. And so, it makes sense. But then those who embrace the opposite, the Robert E. Lees, I wonder to what extent. I've not spoken to anyone who supports this position.
Right.
Hope to at some point. And I'm curious as to whether or not they want to support this position out of anti-integrationism, out of anti-cultural shift that began in that 1950s era, or is it more of a states' rights issue? Is it more of a, some of these people talk about supporting the Confederacy out of heritage and out of rebelliousness and independence from a federal government, and how they didn't necessarily support slavery. Slavery was on its way out, they argue, all this other kind of stuff. I wonder to what extent there's some genuine people who observe Robert E. Lee Day for these positions, or is it just an antagonistic sort of reactionary feel of attachment that these people have with this guy?
I mean, I could put that on for me, I feel like that could be put on a spectrum. I believe that there are individuals who do it purely to troll, to be antagonistic. I think there are individuals that would observe it for many of the reasons you already stated, the notion of states' rights, and then again, one could make an argument that simply because I'm observing Robert E. Lee Day It has nothing to do with Dr. King, to be honest with you. It just coincidentally happens to occur on the same day. And if I had to pick and choose which individual I resonate more with more, it would be Robert E. Lee. I can imagine there are a wide array of individuals who would make those statements, make that argument as to why they would observe it more so than a Dr. King Day. I mean, and maybe in their community they don't get challenged as to why, and that could be fair, right? Like let's you want to do Robert E. Lee Day? Okay, cool. And maybe it could be on a different day, or Now here's what I've learned. This Robert E. Lee Day is not always at the same date. It has like this rolling vibe in certain states. In certain states, it's recognized on this day. Certain states, it's recognized on another day, because some states don't want it to interfere with Dr. King Day, because then they will be perceived as racist, or antagonistic towards a civil rights icon.
That's interesting. I wish we had already had this conversation. It's going to happen in February, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's like February 21st or something. We'll talk about it more. I hope you go, and I hope you bring your students, and everybody listening shows up too. Sam Haynes is a professor at UTA of Texas in the Southwest era, who just came out with another book. And he's coming to our campus to talk about his book at 12:30 on the day, like in the middle of the week, when Jeannie teaches her Texas history class, so she can bring that class. And I've heard him talk already at other events about this book, which is why I moved to get him up here. He talks a lot about memorialization and what that means. What is memorialization? Remember, I gave a speech once to the Weatherford NAACP chapter, right, as we were arguing for the removal of that Confederate statue. If you remember, right, you were there. Well, and you and I went to see that statue together once or twice as we were thinking about. And I was contemplating on what I was going to say. I remember we took Meadow and them with us, and some of my friends have been over there getting abused big time at that protest. But all of these things kind of so brings me back to this idea of memorializing history. Like we have a tendency sometimes to think of memorialization as being something to do with the past, when really it's not. And it's funny because a lot of these people who are against removing these monuments, these Confederate monuments, they say, well, we want to tear down history. We want to mess up history and forget about history. And they're making that classic mistake here by thinking that this statue is actually about history. It's not. Memorializing Martin Luther King is not about Martin Luther King. Memorializing Robert E. Lee is not about Robert E. Lee. It's about a lot more. It's about the mood of the people in the nation, the dominant belief systems and cultures that they've come to acquire over decades of lived experiences with each other, arguing over different positions and interpretations. And once they settle on a dominant sort of hegemonic structure or view or position, they begin to reinforce that position through memorialization, right? You want to look to this figure historically to make you feel warm and fuzzy about a position today that you're supposed to feel and act upon. Right. And I think that's one of the problems there is when we talk about these memorialization projects, we oftentimes don't understand the purpose behind them, or the directions or the why. We just go with the memorial without reflecting on these bigger or larger questions that can, I think, illuminate for us motive and intent amongst people who create them.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can look at other memorials that are not um, influenced by individuals, but maybe like a veterans memorial.
Yeah.
And again, that's our society recognizing the reverence we have for people that serve this country in whatever capacity that may be.
So that the more people will be willing to sign up and go do it again today, right?
Right.
That's the purpose there. We can take any memorial, and we can explain what purpose it serves today.
Yeah.
And
Uh, you know, the biggest one that comes to my mind would probably be, I mean, is it the Vietnam War memorial?
yeah,
That's the black one, right,
see,
with the names.
yeah,
Um, and I'm not sure what that says about us as a nation. But memorials at times, maybe like the fact that they exist, it does, or maybe it does compel one to reflect. I mean, Dr. King Day is a memorial. The day in of itself is a memorial, and I know for a fact, I do take that time to reflect. I really do. Like when people are like, "Hey, what'd you do? What'd you do on your day off?" Like it's not a day off for me. It's a day to for me to get back in tune with some of his speeches. Um,
what though?
you know
Yeah,
some of the,
why?
and then
So
I
you
talk to my
can
kids about it.
teach them a lesson on how to behave in the present day. That's the ultimate purpose behind it, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Um, it's not about the history, or you'd have a history every day. Every day you'd be reflecting on something, and the focus would be on the actual events. Particularly, I don't even know what that would be, because, in my opinion, there is no sort of history for history's sake. All history has meaning, has context, has purpose for the society that's uh, telling it.
So with that being said, then what's your take on a Confederate memorial?
A Confederate memorial has no place in the United States
Hmm.
of America, because
But there was a time in which it could.
when the Confederacy was alive, if they would have won, then there would have been a time and purpose for Confederate monuments all over, because they would have needed them to try to convince everybody that their position was right, and fine. But when they lost, um, what had happened was, um, several decades had gone by. Reconstruction began to kind of like make Southerners, I feel, have this sort of reaction. Like the Dunning School reminds me of those cats, right? Who were trying to revise or explain Reconstruction in a way that made the South look better. Kind of like looking at the Civil War with a guilt complex and trying to kind of like maybe mask it. When slavery started to be exposed as something that our country didn't embrace completely anymore, they had to sort of revise the narrative of the war away from it being about slavery, which clearly all the speeches and writings at the beginning of this war state from all these Southerners that that's what they were doing. They didn't start
Right.
talking about states' rights stuff until people started talking about slavery as uh, illegally constitutionally, right? Um, and so it was an attempt to kind of keep their positions alive. And today, um, Confederate monuments can be directly correlated with oppression of certain groups in those locations to where they are, I feel. At least that's certainly the case in Weatherford. And so they should be removed. Now, by should be removed, I mean pressure amongst people to push their city representatives to move these things,
Mhm.
right? Or you can get revolutionary if you want, and go blow them up at night. I mean, there are groups that it always reminds me of this anarchist group in Belgium that goes to these King Leopold II statues and chops off their hands
Mm.
as a symbol because of how much he
Yeah.
did in Congo and chopping off all them people's hands before them to go out there and get rubber. I mean, these are sort of things that, it's interesting kind of stuff to see how society kind of like forces each other and pushes each other at the, why did they attack that monument? They're talking about an issue now, right? And so these struggles over memory and memorialization are about exposing the direction that we feel our society should be on. And
Mhm.
so we venerate those who showed us the path that we're wanting to take, and maybe condemn those who went the other direction.
Yeah. Um, I mean, so what does that say about society right now then? If there are people who would rather, observe Robert E. Lee Day than not Dr. King Day.
I would say it reveals that we are in the middle of something that I call culture war, which we see happening more or less intensely in various decades or so over the course of U.S. history, right? Like I think of the 1950s as in the 60s as strong culture wars. I don't know. Maybe you could argue their culture wars are always going on. There's never a time in which
Right.
culture wars aren't being waged. It's just a
It's
matter of
just
how
which one.
come.
Which one? You make an argument for in the 20s, it could have been over religion.
Right.
80s, religion comes up again.
Right.
60s, everything was on the table.
Right. Right.
uh, and in the 70s, I think the 70s, because it's so close to the 60s, it doesn't get its due. But there's something about the 70s that's very experimental to me.
Yeah.
We tend to associate dramatic, tumultuous change with the 60s, right?
Mm.
But it's not until the 70s do you actually see the implementation of the culture war that took place in the 60s. And it's in the 70s you see, what I mean by experimentation, it's a decade of experimenting with drugs, with issues of gender or gender issues, sex,
Mm-hmm.
race, as we're beginning to see the integration of not only schools on wide scale. You see the proliferation of black cinema and black exploitation films in the 70s, and it's a very experimental decade that I think gets I don't think it gets its fair due. But I agree with you. I think that there are cultural wars constantly going on, and so ours in this current state, in the 2020s, the culture war is still revolving around race,
Certainly.
control, or power, or what?
And I think it's. I think we are living in the prophetic manifestation of what W.E.B. Du Bois mentioned in the early 20th century, when he said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He said that before the 20th century barely even began.
Right.
And 120 years later, I think he's right. It's morphed, transformed, transmogrified, adapted, whatever you want to call it, literally over the course of the decades in the 20th century. But it nevertheless has always been at the forefront of the United States, because the United States is the quintessential racist country. That's what we were built on, right? I don't understand how anyone can deny that. That this country was built on race, that this country was created in a world where culturally race had developed, functioned to establish a kind of system, an order, a structure. And that brings me back to something that you said about people who observe this Robert E. Lee Day. You said something just a few minutes ago about a fear of losing something, a fear of maybe not, something losing. And I think that's always sort of been there. This notion, of race was created, I think, to protect something within European culture. And every transformation that existed from racialized slavery to the domestication of slavery, to the cult of domesticity, to the Jim Crow mentality, to the Negro cocaine fiend, all the way up to the present day. I mean, all of these different perceptions, I think, were all about trying to protect this identity that white European descended US Americans built the country on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely I mean, the issue of, so if we go with the Du Bois line of the most explosive issue will be the issue of the color line.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for the 2020s, the issue is not a color line. Maybe it's an identity line. Maybe it's an issue of identity on a wide scale. What does it mean to be a man? And we're seeing the struggles with that regarding, not regarding, but where you have young males looking into and feeding into this hyper misogynistic Andrew Tate-ish environment. What does it mean to be a woman? What is the issue of trans? What is Latinx? That identity now more than ever is of extreme importance and value, like we've never seen it before. The ability to define oneself could quite possibly be like your greatest achievement. The ability to define yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you something else. So for the African American community to finally define what it means to be Black in America, that's important. And this is the 1920s. For women to say, no, this is what we believe femininity is about, not what men have argued for us. We, the women, will identify what it means to be a woman. We see this with the flapper movement of the 1920s. Identity is important.
Sure.
And I think there's I don't think there's obviously a spectrum of American society where white males feel, and maybe even white women, that their identity is being vilified, demonized, in place of the veneration and memorialization of African Americans. So we'll take down a white statue, or we'll take down a statue of a white person, and in its place put up a statue of a black person. That obviously is going to trigger this person to think that, or that person to think this. But I think identity might be our biggest issue at the moment.
So two things here, and they both revolve around this very important adage, I think, that you can come to by studying history, which is that every action has a reaction. Even if your actions are just or well-intentioned or abhorrently evil, there are going to be reactions. There'll be reactions that you can predict. There'll be reactions that you didn't think of that just come out of the blue. There'll be reactions to reactions and all kinds of other things. And so what we see here are two examples that I like to think of. When you vilify other people's identity the way U.S. Americans vilified Black identity in the late 19th century and early 20th century, or if you subjugate Black identity the way U.S. Americans subjugated Blackness in the 1830s and the 1840s by sort of I'm thinking of the yes master slave mentality, the dutiful obeying slave that everybody thought existed, gone with the wind, and then 20 years later, after the Civil War, all of a sudden it's these vicious monstrosity animals who want to just like commit all these crimes, right? People have a tendency to create these identities for their own purposes, and you're going to have a reaction to them, right? And so it's important to pay attention to this if you are someone who feels the way that you described about white identity being vilified, right? It's worth looking into this concept of reaping what we sow historically, oftentimes. And then I would also add a second point to that reaction concept, this idea of speciesism that we talked about previously, where people are now even going to the extent in which they treat animals the exact same way as humans. I mean, I had a conversation with Nilly the other day in her office, man, and she's like it's interesting to see her be so like visually upset and traumatized, she would say, by having to go to the cafeteria and eat with people. And I think it just goes to show how much a shift can go off in directions that you may not think. When we began the 64 and 65 Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act and started to develop a strong, dominant culture against discrimination and promoting diversity and making the argument that more people identity-wise count, what do? You get all kinds of other floodgates of people who maybe have had identity thoughts in their mind previously and were scared to discuss them, are now more emboldened, and they'll come out with all kinds of stuff like, what do you call them, furries? You heard of them?
Yeah.
We got furry people running around like animals and stuff like this,
Right. And I think it's important to that even if we mention flurry in the same sentence of African Americans wanting to be respected as human beings, we're not equating the two.
Right.
There's a tendency when people hear, "Are you calling? Are you equating the African American struggle for rights with this guy's sexual kink. No, relax. But there's a
No, what
tendency for
we're doing,
people.
yeah. Instead, what we're saying is that when you begin to tell people that their identity matters, that their
Right.
purpose matters, and that we need to respect it, you're inevitably going to have other ideas pop up and be allowed into the public forum in ways that they were maybe not previously prepared to do. And so it takes you down roads and flips everything to the point where you see drastic transformations in societies. You know, if you go back to the 1970s and you talk to these to the gay rights underground people, I imagine, again, no way to really prove it, but I'd imagine that they wouldn't even ever remotely think that there'd be a day decades down the road where people are arguing about who gets to go to the bathroom, right?
Right.
In their specific, like, transgender bathroom, male, female bathroom, or
Mhm.
pronouns issues. They were trying to survive and not be murdered.
Right.
Right. And it was about that. But then once we start, again, accepting those things, you have these reactions and opening ups, and oftentimes what will happen is that people who maybe didn't agree in the first place, or who reluctantly agreed, or maybe who just didn't otherwise care, sometimes will get annoyed with the directions that they're going, and they'll blame the opening up of society, or they'll blame these new directions on the opening up of society, and then they'll try to pick a memorialization project that goes back to the way the good old days were,
Right.
uh, where, you know, they recognize things as being bad. I don't know why it popped in my head, but I remember one of them Duck Dynasty dudes, them big beards,
Mhm.
was like a preacher or something, one of the
Mhm.
old cats. And he was talking to somebody and was like, "Yeah, man, I remember growing up and hanging out, and then black people they didn't care. Everything was great. And here they're all running in the streets and going crazy, and we've made it a problem, and there was not even any problem." And it's like, you can't even see that there was a problem around you back then, because you didn't, black people identity didn't count to you so much that you didn't even recognize the pain that they were going through. And now you see this, and it gives a distorted comparison, and starts getting you to memorialize and double down on this archaic idea that was the cause of a lot of pain and struggle for people.
Mhm. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, it does. And there's definitely a doubling down. And the doubling down lends itself to what, the hyper extreme of whatever it may be. So, for example, well, I don't. It 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 almost feels like I can't be a man. So you know what I'm going to be? I'm going to be a hyper toxic masculine individual. I
Mm.
almost feel like I can't be the way I used to be in the good old days. And so now I'm going to begin getting more in touch with states' rights, the
Mm.
Civil War, the American Revolution, 1776. That's Alex Jones. If you go look at Alex Jones's whole scheme, if you will, and he by the way, he sells merchandise and paraphernalia that says 1776 on it. Um, because he believes that we need to re-engage in revolutionary action.
Mm.
Um, and I the desire to, and this what's interesting is that this community, when I say this community, like white America, or an element of white America, apparently they feel like their identity is threatened. It's under attack. What they know or what they see themselves as, they obviously feel that it's attacked. And as a response to that, You have this, well, I'm going to control the narrative as much as possible with Monument. You have Sarah Huckabee Sanders, right? The governor of Georgia. She goes, nowhere in any of our policies or state statutes will we recognize the term Latinx.
Right.
The notion of pronouns, it's interesting because you have one group saying, can you just respect me as I see myself? And they go, no. But yet they're asking that you respect how they see themselves. It's definitely an identity issue, and nobody, well, I don't want to say nobody wants to give, but there's a particular group out there that their inability to have perspective has dangerous consequences, psychologically, mentally, and in some cases physically, where your inability to recognize this other individual as a human being could cost them their life.
Right.
And it's not the other way around. You're not running into many people that are transgendered.
Why?
Threatening the lives of.
Well, this is why. Because the identity of those who feel threatened by the transgender or the Black citizen was built upon the oppression of those people, was built on the rejection of those people, was built on the exploitation of those people. Right? I mean, let's keep it real. I mean, transgender, right, that kind of stuff has been around for a long time. The amount of
Right.
rape and brutal treatment of people, or it reminds me of the Berdache, or in Native American cultures, or same-sex relationships or intercourse. This stuff's been around for a very long time, but it was oftentimes considered illegitimate. There were power dynamics connected to them. And the same goes with race, right? There was significant amount of power dynamics connected to the creation of Blackness and whiteness and the exploitation of Blackness. And, what this shows, I think, is that, the way we imagine ourselves is very real. I can see the pain in Millie when she thinks about animals being eaten, but for other people, it's not a big deal. In the same way, it's like you can see the pain of Black people or transgender people whose lives are being deeply affected by
Right.
other states, yet some of these people are like, it's not a big deal because that's how they're supposed to be in their mind, right? And so, all this really shows the power of culture, man. That's why in every conversation we have, it's going to boil down to the superiority of culture. This is why I'm always denigrating jokingly military historians, political historians, economic historians, so anyone who's not a culturalist, because it all boils down to culture. If you really want to understand meaning and you really want to understand reactions and belief systems and behavior and lived experience, which is what this world is built upon, is what humanity built upon, is the collective memory of those who came before us combined with the lived experiences that we have today, interacting in this very nuanced way for us to develop a status quo or a position or a structure. And so everybody should be paying attention to culture. I'm not biased or anything, but that's just the way it is.
Would you call a cultural historian like another word for a sociologist?
No. Some sociologists act like cultural historians, but others focus more on social history, which is sort of like just counting shit, like data driven. It's less about explaining why and more explaining about how and what. Um, there were X amount of people who, wore wool clothing, or uh, the women when they were in the, and we're gonna include women in the historical narrative by talking about how many women bought washing machines and used washing machines in the 1920s, whereas a cultural historian will be like, well, what's the meaning of that? What we get at the heart of what where meaning is derived from, how meaning gets invested into the things that we use, the social status that is connected to having the washing machine, and the freeing you up to do these other things, and you focusing on those other things and the impact that those other things have on your identity and on the things that come before, instead of just counting them.
Hmm.
But it is very interdisciplinary. Like, there are sociologists, like Durkheim is very important sociologist for cultural historians, or Max Weber, but also cultural anthropologists, um, food culturalists.
Du Bois.
Yeah, certainly, absolutely, and some aspects of economists. It's very interdisciplinary, which I think is why it's so superior, because it's taking pieces of everything, pieces of multiple disciplines or fields, uh, taking the good out of many different things, to construct the narratives of investigation. And that's why I think it's so valuable.
Yeah. Sure, man, for sure.
But King, yeah, man, King, Martin Luther King. Um, Powerful
Yeah.
figure.
Oh, sure, man. I mean, and like I said, like even when we were considering, because we want to push it Monday, and drop it Monday. That's going to be our thing for sure. But I guess the observance of Dr. King day is usually on a Monday,
Yeah.
right? So
Right.
We'll be in future, yeah, in 2024, we're gonna have to push it to a Tuesday
Yeah.
at least once. And again, man, it's for me, it's because if that is a memorial, it look. I think the symbol has the capacity to lead you to, well, the symbol might drive you to the substance.
Mm.
And if so, like, and for me, I've never been, being not an advocate, but at the very least, being more intrigued by Malcolm X. It did jade me a bit on how I view Dr. King, and it's only I definitely developed this understanding that in order to truly understand Malcolm, I gotta know Dr. King. I gotta know why there was this animosity. Where was the potential for collaboration or cooperation? And then that led me to better understand King, respect King, appreciate King. And man, I now, on days like tomorrow, I make it very clear to my kids, this ain't no day off from school. This is a time for us to think about change. Is it possible? How do we be better? You said it earlier. um, forget exactly how you phrased it, but it was just like how to be good, like how to be a good person or a good human or whatever it was. He said something along those lines.
Yeah.
And that's what memorials should teach us. Uh, how or who we want to be. And sometimes memorials have to go because our society grows and changes, and we no longer want to revere an individual like Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, for sure. Man, for me, King, I think represents so much. Um, I agree with you about the assessment of Malcolm and King, and I always tend to have these two different paths that I talk about. Um, but I can tell you, the more I've studied King, the more I've come to respect him as well, um, as maybe a true revolutionary in a society that very well does away with revolutionaries. Um, or maybe I should say that differently. A revolution. He figured out a way. He adapted. An adaptive revolutionary, someone who knew how to be a revolutionary in a country where there really aren't very many revolutionaries. They
Right.
usually die quick, and the irony is that so did he. Um, but someone who really put work in first, someone who took advantage of education like many people haven't ever. Like for real, I don't think people focus enough on how hardworking educationally Martin Luther King was. Achieving a PhD as a black man in the 40s, I think it was, or 50s, or in the 40s maybe. Uh,
What
Crozer,
when he earned his PhD?
yeah, I think it was in the 40s, late 40s, and not just going to class, but um, participating in outside of campus, outside of classroom campus activities, which is something I tell my students all the time. You know, if King didn't show up to a presentation that Mordecai Johnson gave on his campus uh, when he was a theological student at Crozer Theological Seminary, he may not have ever heard about Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And when he heard about it, he didn't just get inspired and then get to work and try to enact it. He went to work by reading tremendously amount of material outside of what was required of him in the classroom. Like, yo, I mean, look at these people. And you want to be successful, man. They got the blueprint available for you. Put work in, go beyond classroom. We can't be over here arguing with you, trying to get you to show up to class on time. Like we're talking about a dude who's going to class and then building up on that stuff and building his own reading list afterwards, who then once he makes his mind up of the need is constantly on the run, moving, going to the detriment of his own health, man. Um, you know, we oftentimes talk a lot about his charisma, but to me, that loses, I think, a little bit of the importance of his effort and his work ethic, which was phenomenally powerful, man.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the charisma, it kind of it does a disservice
Yeah,
to the legitimate work he put in.
right.
There's you know there's a tendency that, oh well, if someone's just born charismatic, But a work ethic is tough. That's something you got to develop, and being consistent, and but not being too rigid either.
Right.
On perspective. Towards the end of his life, you know, man, he was so introspective on certain things that you would never think he would question.
Mm.
And to go to bed every night with the possibility of, violent threats, and to reflect on, your actions, reflect on your words, and not being afraid to maybe pivot.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
Changing, evolving. That's what you do when you study and you learn and you live and you develop and you evolve. All greatness comes from that. No great figure historically is static, no matter how much we see them in a snapshot of time at a particular location and observe their actions. None of these great figures were one dimensional. They were multifaceted. They were evolving. They were constantly growing and learning and adapting and interacting and reacting. Um, I mean, Malcolm as well. Well, certainly. I just feel like King maybe had um, more of a upper level education and philosophy that separated him from all those other people like that, those greats. Um, Malcolm had a much more difficult childhood than Malcolm X, or than Martin Luther King, and I think you can see the difference there. Um, but yeah, man, I don't know. It's interesting stuff. Is he
yep,
worthy of the only man with to have the title that he has? Like you said early on.
Without question, and I don't, in all of my lectures, when I do 1302 courses, without question, he could quite possibly be the greatest American of all time.
Mm. You think we believe that if he didn't die?
That's an unfortunate. So the tragedy of an untimely death adds to the legend.
Definitely.
We see that with musicians. We see that with artists.
Right.
Either you die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Who would have been? Who could have King become? Would he have turned into a Jesse Jackson?
Yeah.
Would he have turned into an Al Sharpton?
Right.
Would he have turned,
And what's interesting to think of? If he didn't turn into one of those people, would he be so vilified by the media as to develop a whole entirely different persona as an Uncle Tomish character?
He would have been. I think he would. And the thing, the beauty of that, is it Fred Hampton?
Mm-hmm.
You can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. Isn't that him?
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, unfortunately, at the age of 40, I tell my students this also, is like, that man took a bullet so that we could just have something just a little bit better. And I go, and he didn't have to do any of that.
Right.
He was a 25-year-old man, and he didn't have to do a single thing, Nathan, nada, for no one. But he chose that route. And I tell my students, he took a bullet for all of us. And I wouldn't take a hard pinch for none of you. I wouldn't take a hard pinch for none of you. And that's why there's never going to be a Eric Salas day.
Yeah.
We don't need one. So that's for sure. But that's about it. Yeah.
It's different, man. Different times, different things, man. Nowadays, we got different callings we got to do. Can't be messing around out here getting shot. You know what I mean? Got talking to do. And it's purposes and drives, and people are, they find situations that they're in, and they take it. I think Gandalf said it once in one of the Lord of the Rings books, where he's like, it's not us. It's not up to us to decide, or something about it's not up to us to decide the time or something like that. It's only up to us to decide what to do with the time that's given to us. And when we find ourselves in these situations, man, we do what needs to be done, or we don't. And King did what needed to be done more powerfully than anybody else. I think I don't know. You're free, but to think of something. But I got a good King quote that I like. There's so many of them, but to me, it kind of fits a little bit with some of the stuff that we've talked about. Very underground. And she says, quote, rarely do we find people who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. That came to me when we were talking about memorialization and memory, and how just so little people really engage in hard, solid thinking when it comes to the reasoning behind our memorialization. But of course, it can apply to a lot more as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that to engage in that process, it might require you to change your perspective.
Yeah.
And people are, and as I've said before in an earlier podcast, people aren't afraid of change. People are afraid of loss.
Mm.
We like to think people are afraid of change. They're not. They're afraid of loss.
Yeah, for sure. I ain't afraid of changing into my neighborhood. I'm afraid of losing my office.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's coming, man. But hey, I guess that's it for us.
Yeah, man. All right. Yeah, we went over a little bit of time, but it's good. We're within our range. So see y'all next week.
All right, man.
Peace.
All right, take it easy.